That's quite a build-up here. So I've got to deliver here to you folks. But thanks for having me here. I came in from San Francisco yesterday, and I'm happy to be here, hanging out with you all tonight. We're going to talk, I guess, do we have the slides up here? Because we're going to go through a lot of slides here. So let's keep the slides up as much as we can here, as you can see me here, and you don't need to see me on these things. We're going to talk about the great progression here, which I'll get into in a minute. But before we kind of get into this, I want to just take a moment here as you're into this data revolution of yourself and just make a point that we are in a moment here that really, honestly, human beings are going to remember for a long time. We are at a kind of a crazy moment in kind of human history, I would go so far, as in that we are really opening up now what I would call the age of AI. Now, AI has been around for a little bit. We'll chat about that later. But what's happened in the last 6 months has blown this open in a way that I think we just have to step and pause for a minute, which is, humans are now going to go from this point forward working closely with intelligent machines. Now, we've had a previous breakthrough when humans went from their own muscle power and kind of horsepower, horses, to essentially cracking a new technology of mechanical engines, which then allowed us to leverage and augment our power and to get like 200 horses working for us in an engine. And we saw what that led to, the Industrial Revolution and crazy kind of scaling up around the planet and create the world that we got today. We'll put it this way. Humans have just come across another threshold. Up until now, anything that had to do with intelligence had to be done by a human brain. And yet what's happened in the last, you could say, right recently here, is now we are opening up an age where the machines can actually do intelligent things. And that is a step change in actually what human beings can do. And it's going to have profound implications, which we're going to start touching on. Now, what happened, I know you folks have actually been using AI, and other companies have used it, and the governments have used it for a while. But what happened in the last 6 months was the emergence of generative AI. And the reason this is so important is essentially the advent of this generative AI essentially opened up AI to everyone. I mean everyone. In a way, we had basically 100 million people basically tried it out in the first 2 months, actually, when ChatGPT came through in November there. And the reason that's important is just like the internet. In fact, the only comparable thing I think we've been through is the internet, and I think this is going to be a bigger deal. And as you mentioned, I was in the early days of that internet, which I'll get into later. But we had the internet before that. In fact, the military had the internet as early as the 70s. Companies and governments had been using some form of the internet. But it was opening up the internet to everybody with the World Wide Web and the kind of easy access to the internet that exploded and actually opened up the digital revolution that and the kind of what we call the digital transformation that businesses are still working with today. And so it's that comparable thing. Once you open up a game-changing technology like to everybody, that's when the explosion became. And that's what happened. Now, I mentioned I just came in from San Francisco. And just, there's been stories recently in the mainstream media and European media. It's like, oh my God, what's happening in San Francisco and California? People are leaving it, that kind of thing. Just about when they always do this. They do this about every 5 years. And every time that happens, that's when San Francisco's on to the next big thing. And so what's happening now in San Francisco, I've just been in there for the last 6 months. I've been up to my eyeballs in this. There are people streaming in from all over the country, all over the world. I mean, people are quitting MIT. They got houses in San Francisco with 12 people in and out. People are couch surfing every place because there's this moment where people are realizing, oh my God, there is a moment here where we're really going to have another great transformation. And I think it's really true. And so what I've been doing, he mentioned how I've been connected up to people from all over the Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, which is true over the last 25, 30 years. What I've been doing is convening. I've started a new series of events that I've been convening. Really think about it as all kinds of experts in AI, all kinds of former founders, all kinds of academics, all kinds of folks in a series of gatherings, which we just had one 2 weeks ago. We got one in another week here. In which we're looking at some of these key issues. That one of the last one we just did one on what are the real implications of AI. And this is kind of cool. By the way, this thing I created using Midjourney. And I'm no artist, honestly. But actually using one of these tools you can actually create something like this. So I thought this was kind of evocative of essentially what we're doing. We're starting out with a crude kind of machine, intelligent machine. We're walking kind of down a path, which just opening up. It's misty. We don't know where we're going. But boy, we're in for a long journey. But we're going to do next week, I'm doing one, which in fact is looking more at the big picture, the positive possibilities over the next 25 years or so. And this is, again, this image is evocative. Again, one I created here, which was evocative of like, the machine in the next 25 years is going to get quite sophisticated, but hopefully it'll be in sync with us as humans, and we'll be able to look far and actually see a very sunny future. We're going to be talking about that. And then the third one, though, we're going to do in July, is that there are some actual risks with this. Not that, humans are going to be extinct, all that kind of craziness that you're hearing out there in the media right now. But there are risks, and we're going to be engaging with that. And so anyhow, I'm doing this kind of way of doing this is bring these people together. Now, what I'm going to do to you is distill a lot of what I'm learning and try to condense it into this hour-long conversation here. Now, which gets us back to the talk of the day. I just wanted to kind of preface this that, oh my God, folks, if you haven't gotten excited enough about what's happening here, particularly as a data company, we'll flick at that. We'll get back to AI in a minute here. Now, the great progression is one of the things I'm actually going to lay out to you today is that we're on the verge of, I think, a great era of progress. Funny enough, not kind of gloom and doom, but in fact, an era of great progress. And what I'm going to try to talk to you in a very rapid-fire way with a lot of slides is tell you what's really going on, flip it from doom and gloom to actually very positive, tell you what's probably coming in the next 10 years. I got a great track record on this. I'm going to kind of make that case. I'm going to tell you what's possible to achieve in 25 years, and I'm going to tell you, kind of allude to what you can do. Not specifically, we only got an hour, what can you do? But we're going to do a pretty good shot at this. This is what my company, it's a strategic foresight company based in San Francisco there. We do that all the time with C-suites, boards, all kinds of folks. Because if you can answer these 4 questions or even give any kind of insight into those 4 questions, that's valuable. And so that's what I do. That's my day job. And then I come and talk to folks in these bigger situations a little bit on the side. Now, one reason there's so much gloom and doom out there, I mean, if you talk about, what's happening, what's the future, people have this totally apocalyptic sense of what we're heading into, climate change, political polarization, oh my God, inequality, all this kind of stuff that's going on there. But I'm going to tell you actually that, in fact, it's a much more positive reframe of what's happening out there. I'm going to point this out to you and make a case to you so you'll be able to kind of rethink a little bit some of that doomer kind of way of thinking about things. And the reason I would say that this doomer sense kind of comes out, is that there is a system. There's an old system. Let me just go back on that. There's an old system that is essentially made up of a bunch of subsystems that most people in this room have basically lived through for the last 40 years. Those who started your career, let's say in the 80s or something. And, a lot of this Gen Xers here, they probably started a little bit later. But anyhow, there's a system that is essentially going away. And so if you talk about the last 40 years, you say, well, so what's the big meta challenge of America and the world? Certainly the West was terrorism. We were freaked out about terrorism. Energy was totally carbon. Transportation was completely rooted in the internal combustion engine. The culture was totally dominated by the boomers. Boomers actually politically were more conservative than people, they think, the 60s, all that. But in fact, from a voting point of view, it was more conservative. The politics that came out of that was more kind of energizing the private sector. Capitalism was very much focused on shareholder value to pretty much, that was the main thing. Work was all in physical places, downtown offices or physical any place you want. Production was industrial, a perfection, something we've been doing since the Industrial Revolution. Geopolitics was all about the Middle East. We had 2 wars in there. Why? To keep the oil going, to keep the whole flywheel going, to keep that whole thing happening. I'm saying, increasingly, you got to think about that as the past. Again, there's a lot of life still kind of kicking in there, and there's going to be a lot of things that are happening there. But I want to just pose to you to get you thinking that what's amazing is in every one of those categories, we have a different nascent system that's starting to emerge here. And it's getting enough traction that you can understand it. So the meta challenge of our time is undeniably climate change. We'll talk a lot about that. Energy is already moving fast to clean. Transportation, just mind-blowing what's happened the last 5 years around electric cars and electric transportation. Culture is being dominated by the millennials and their issues. The children essentially the boomers. Politics is, I would argue, and this gets a little controversial, but I'm going to make a case to get you thinking, it's going to be trending more progressive. Economics is going to have a bigger role for the private sector. We've already seen that with the pandemic and other things that are happening. Capitalism is going to broaden to more of a stakeholder capitalism. We're already talking a lot about that. work, we saw it has already started to become much more virtual in ways we couldn't imagine even a decade ago. Production is going to become more biological. This takes a little more thinking, and I'll talk to it later. But essentially, we're entering an age of essentially genetic engineering, basically, and biological engineering, which is essentially we're going to grow things that we once kind of made through industrial processes. And geopolitics is more shifted on Asia because really that's what you got to solve for the whole climate thing, plus the rise of China. Anyhow, that whole world is on this side of the divide. You folks, all of us, happen to be living in the 2020s when we're going from that side of the cliff to the other side of the canyon. And that's a good kind of concise way to understand the crazy amount of system change we're moving into here. Now, I wrote an article about this it's gotten a lot of traction last fall called The Great Progression. And it was trying to rough out this big picture look at the next 25 years along these lines. And one of the things that it came up with, which was extremely well received, and people love this thing, which is, again, the basis of a lot of this talk here, which I've been given a lot of places. And one of the things about the piece that made kind of people think was we're going through essentially 3 world historic technology transformations in the next 25 years. One is essentially the next digital evolution here, which is AI. And I gave you just a flavor of how big a deal that is. But it's not just that one. We are shifting to clean energies in a time frame that we've never gone through this fast of a transition. And on the edge of this, there might even be some breakthroughs in fusion energy, which we might touch on later. And the third thing is so there's a kind of energy technologies, there's digital technologies, AI, energy technologies, clean energies, and basically this is the final one is biotechnologies, essentially synthetic biology. I alluded to that and I talked about this. So we've got 3 of these things. Now, what this is opening up, and I gave a little intro here, so I'm not going to spend much time here, is humans are reaching a threshold or crossing a threshold that we will keep in. It'll last for centuries. I mean, once, barring some tragedy or something, some crazy nuclear bomb ourselves back to whatever. But essentially, this is why I use the word age. We're not entering a little era here. We're entering an age, just like we entered the age of electricity. You don't go back after you figure out electricity. You're not going to go back after you figure out AI. But the same thing, we are now going through the age of clean energy. We're entering an age which, after we go through this, it's going to be, why would you ever go back to carbon? I mean, we're not going to do that. This is like a thing that's going to be an age. And the third one is, once you understand how to kind of essentially engineer all living things, potentially even ourselves, you're not going to throw away that knowledge and go backwards. So, in fact, people literally 500 years are going to look back and say, oh, that's when they figured out genetic engineering. Oh, that's when they figured out kind of clean energy. Oh, that's when they figured out AI. That's the level of a thing, a triple whammy thing we're going through right now, which is a very big deal. And so in concrete terms, there are these things there are some inexorable developments that are going to come out of this. I call them the inexorables. They're just going to happen one way or the other. There may be slow them down a little bit or channel them a little bit, but we're going to see this, and one is going to be universal connectivity. That's just finishing the last era's thing. We got another 3 billion people to bring on the internet. There's 3 billion people still are not on the internet. We're going to do that this decade, no problem. We're going to have ubiquitous, cheap AI, accessible to everyone, anywhere, basically energizing everything we do, giving us an augmented superpower that is going to be really something coming up here. It is going to accelerate innovation. It's already happening. And it's just, we thought the last 40 years were actually moving fast, and the 90s were fast, or the last decade, it's like we're going to go a lot faster. I mentioned the clean energies. I mentioned the electric mobility. Those are just inexorable. They're going to happen. Genetic understanding, we're just going to understand more and more about how all living things work. We're understand how to master, how to manipulate that, and keep going. And we're going to see, but we're also going to see some things that aren't about technology. We're going to see a generational shift. I started to allude to that, the millennials and what are coming, but that will essentially also lead to some new political majorities that I think will change politics. So I'm going to basically try to give you, not all these because we don't have enough time, but some of these that gives you that sense. Now, in the even bigger picture, I want to just lay this out to you. If you think about this century to the end, 2100, and anyone with a kid who's a millennial or anyone with a kid who's a Gen Z right now, they will see the end of the century. There's no doubt human lifespans will go well to 100, if not, they think it might top out at 120. But basically, these kids are going to see this. So if you sit there and go, who cares about 2100? care about it because it's based on your kids, your legacy. And I think by the end of the century, we will see essentially a civilization scale changes where everything is digital. You talk about your digital transformation. We are probably going to see systems that are essentially fully global or working on a planetary scale. It's the only way to probably ultimately solve climate change. And ultimately, we'll figure out a way that 10 billion people can live on a planet, Earth, in a way that we don't kind of blow the thing to pieces. And so that thing, which is a distant dream, is probably going to happen, I would argue. Now, you say, okay, why would I listen to this guy? So I want to go back to what I was introduced to say. Is back in the 90s, I was literally working with the founders of Wired magazine, later ran the magazine in the heyday in the 90s there. But one of the things I did there is did a cover story here, which later went into a book. He mentioned my book. It went into multiple languages, all kinds of stuff. I spoke around it for 10 years. And but what this did was essentially in the mid-90s, nobody understood what's a digital revolution? How would a digital economy work? What's an Amazon? Like, how does that startup? How are they even matter? No one's going to put their credit card on the internet. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that was going on at that time, right? And so we laid out, because I did it with one of the famous futurists of that time, Peter Schwartz, the two of us. We laid out, okay, here's what we think could happen in the next 25 years. From the mid-90s to the year 2020. We laid this whole thing out. We call it the long boom, a great tech boom, a great economic boom, because it was also tying in to globalization. It was not just technology change, but we were watching the connectivity, essentially, of the planet in ways we had never seen before by bringing in China, bringing in the collapsed Soviet Union, all kinds of stuff. And we laid this thing out. It was a very positive kind of story. Now, what happened is we also laid out 10 things that could go wrong. And funny enough, all 10 have actually happened. But the creative stories, the positive things kept coming. And the internet was going nutty about this in 2020 when we hit the 2020 mark, because all 10 of those things happened, including, basically, we had said, you know what? We're probably going to see a global pandemic that's going to be like the influenza 1918 influential thing, because, if we're connecting all these people and we got flights going all over, we'll probably see another pandemic. Boom. We also said, the Soviet Union will probably kind of end up, their liberalizing will kind of come to an end. They'll try to retrench back into some kind of bad news, kind of nationalistic, kind of quasi-Tsar state, and, boom. And that they'll threaten Europe and, potentially even wage war. Boom, there's Ukraine, right? I mean, so there's a bunch of stuff that was kind of scarily in there. But what happened beyond all that, what was even crazier, was that didn't stop it. That didn't stop what was happening. We said, hey, one thing we're going to do is we're going to see the doubling of computer power every 2 years. That's the Moore's Law thing. This is a logarithmic chart, by the way, for all the math people meaning. That's changed. In other words, if you did this as a normal chart, this thing would be a skyscraper about 70 stories up right now. But this just shows you that we saw a doubling of computer power and a drop, essentially a halving of costs that went on for literally 40, actually more than that, 50 years. And then brought these costs down. So for example, here's the thing, people forget this, but gigabytes, it costs $700,000 for 1 gigabyte of memory, basically in 1980. And now it's like a penny, right? And every one in your phone has, hundreds of these things right now, right? Crazy drop. These are facts. People on the internet, mid-90s, 25 million people were on the internet. It was mostly Americans. Boom, now we've got 60% of the planet. By 2020, it was 60% of the planet was on the internet, basically, which is about 4 billion people by 2020. I'm just hitting 2020 because that's what we had predicted. Apple, the month that our cover story came out, Apple was begging Steve Jobs to come back because they were 3 months away from bankruptcy. And he later came back, and he did come back as CEO, right? They were flatlined. Go back to 95. Look, that's their stock price. Basically, once they hit the iPhone and other things due to Jobs' leadership, they became the first trillion-dollar company. There had never been a trillion-dollar private company like that. Never. And in fact, and it wasn't just Apple. By the end, this is 10 years before 2020, 2011 here, this was the most valuable companies in the world. 3 of them were oil companies. Makes sense. Basically, one of them, Apple, had snuck in there because of the iPhone a couple years earlier. The other one's a Chinese bank. Basically, you go to 2020. When you hit 2020, you had all American companies, tech companies, all West Coast, 3 of them in San Francisco, 2 in Seattle, and they all were trillion-dollar companies. Actually, Facebook was a little shy of that, but later hit a trillion. And it was a completely transformed the global economy, which we had said. This is going to happen. But it wasn't just those tech companies. GDP growth kept going. That little dip, by the way, is just the pandemic, which we've bounced back from. China had a $1 trillion economy in 95 when we were writing that story. It later became, essentially, as we know, a superpower in that same period of time. Global growth tracked right with it. It wasn't just China. It was all kinds of different places. The dips, again, are just the pandemic. And here you folks, because I know Paychex was kind of rode this boob too, because you guys are an early 80s company there. But in the mid-90s, essentially, 97, when this cover story came out, we had written it a couple years earlier, a year earlier, developing it. It was the Dow Jones was 5,000, and people basically said, and we were asked at the time, it's like, well, okay, what happened to the boom? You talk about the long boom. What's the long boom? Well, we say it's probably going to drag a stock market boom too. In fact, what happened? Boom! It hit 30,000 by 2020. So we've watched a crazy thing happen before. Now, how could you do that from the mid-90s? Do that? Well, it turns out you can actually explain the future by kind of understanding some techniques. This is a mentor of mine. He mentioned Long Now. He's one of the great strategic foresight people of our era, basically, Stuart Brad. And he helped many people, including myself, understand these new tools. But I'm going to give you a couple quick ones here. There's a kind of long-standing understanding in the tech world about how every successful technology rolls through these stages of adoption, basically. And that's kind of well understood. I'm going to point out this one thing, the tipping point. If you can figure out where the tipping point is this thing, and this is kind of a lot of my job and what I'm trying to do, that's a very valuable thing to understand. And so there's a lot to be said about tipping points. And it relates to what we're heading into here. So I want to make this point. The thing about tipping points is before the tipping point, everyone is kind of lackadaisical, going, yeah, right, it's not going to happen, it's not going to work. And after the tipping point, they go, holy shit, this is amazing, I love this thing. And so every technology kind of goes through this thing, your iPhone, all that kind of stuff that you're used to. The second thing, which has to do with mindset, is people will always hang on to the old idea, the old technology, because they know it, it's easy. Okay, fine. You probably find it in your own company. You know, there's somebody who says, oh, why are we changing the whole thing again? And so, but if you get a new technology, it doesn't just happen automatically. You need a new technology or a new technique, and it gets a little bit of access to other people in the early adopters, and they go, oh my God, this is so much better. And then boom, the thing just goes like that. This is a paradigm shift. This is what they mean by the paradigm shift, right? This happens also with social trends. It's not just technologies, but a trend that's just no one's looking at, and it's starting to be interesting. It's like, let's say, the Me Too movement or something. Okay, this is the way women are in the workforce, and okay, there's something going wrong. Oh, boom, it's a whole new standard. It just happens like, boom, overnight. So this is a thing that everybody's got to kind of understand. Now, speaking of what everyone has to understand, we're going to move fast here, all kinds of stuff, is climate change. And this was a debate. I mean, honestly, I've been doing talks like this for 25 years. I mean, I used to get people throwing stuff at me from the audience sometimes when I bring this up, although I brought it up in different contexts. Climate change, though, is going to absolutely change. The next 25 years are going to be fundamentally shaped by this. And you basically have to understand the numbers on this to really get your head on this, which is basically CO2 levels. CO2 traps heat and rises the temperature of the planet. CO2 levels, since the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago, were flat until the Industrial Revolution, 1750, and we started putting it in, digging up the dinosaur oil, essentially, which is what oil is, the dead dinosaurs and stuff, and basically putting it in the air, and then that's, okay, that's the wrong direction. So that got to be a problem. It's worse than that, though, folks. You go back to human beings, us, Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens, creatures with our brains and our bodies, which would be recognizable today, came about 300 to 250 years ago. So essentially, you go back to those periods, that's when you see those numbers there. Human beings have never actually lived in a planet this hot because there's the CO2 going up through the roof, right? Those ups and downs are ice ages. There is a natural oscillation that does happen through ice ages. Not that we want to go through an ice age, but this is in a different game. Now, you can go way higher than this, and then you got dinosaurs where giant cold-blooded lizards are running around. And, mammals are hot, warm-blooded mammals are like the size of chipmunks because people like us couldn't even live. in that kind of heat. But anyhow, the point is, we're not going to get that far. But anyhow, this is a bad direction to go. So there's been an interesting thing of who's responsible for this is the talk. But if you look back at the carbon, putting the carbon into the air, it's true China and the developing world has been putting in more recently, but we've actually put the most in over the whole haul because we're at early industrial revolution. But what's interesting about the US and the Europe here is that we've been essentially flatlining. Our economies have essentially been putting the same. We're still putting stuff in the air, but we're not going up. And that's because we can and do get more efficient at this thing and are getting less carbon intensive. Anyhow, so there is a way you can do this. Not only that, you can actually drive them down. Oops, sorry, I went too fast there. But these are just basically, if you go to, let's say, the COP meetings or all the UN meetings, we're all trying to figure out, okay, how do we not just flatline, but drive the whole thing down? And some even have to go, well, how do we even pull more carbon out? So this is the conversation that's going to dominate the next 25 years. It already is a big deal, but it's only going to get more of a big deal. Now, luckily, the technology related to this is absolutely on cue, coming in and hitting that same kind of scaling thing that I went on with the digital. And I'm going to run through some of this stuff. I mean, if you would have 10 years ago said, oh, solar energy and everything's going to take off, people would say, yeah, I doubt it. But that has tipped. Not only tipped, and that is gone. We already see how this is happening. I'm going to run through some quick things here. One thing is, solar cells did the same thing with the drop costs, like the gigabyte thing I showed you before. They went from super expensive to dirt cheap, relatively speaking. Now, this is just a new, actually, I just put this in recently today. This is the total cost of installing a solar plant and actually running it for its lifetime with very little maintenance. This is essentially the cost of doing that have gone basically down 90% in the last 10 years. In other words, it used to cost, you can see by the kilowatt hour, it used to be about $350 a kilo in there. It's now down to $40. And so it's cheaper than coal, by far. That's why no one's building the coal. It's just not because it's a politics thing. It's like you'd have to be stupid to do it because it's basically, solar is much cheaper. And it's getting cheaper still. That's the crazy thing about this. So what's happened is you're watching this dramatic growth of solar that's been just hockey stick. These are global numbers. We don't have the time to go too slow on this thing. It is now hitting exponential growth. That's an exponential chart here. And it is now doubling like that microprocessor thing I showed you. And we're watching how in this country, this, by the way, is this is kind of what we have to get to in the United States to get totally onto clean energy by 2035. We had this $350 billion, what they call the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's really a climate change stimulus. Now it looks like we can hit this. This is happening. It's going to move money all through the country, including into red states that were kind of resisted to it. And now, with the government doing those kind of things, we're watching private sector money. This is global finance is now starting to dump incredible amounts of money into clean tech. So last year, it passed $1 trillion of private investment. This is not government investment. That green slot there is in electric vehicles alone. We put in $350 billion of essentially investment went into electric vehicles. And basically, the red there is solar energy. It's like money is shifting in it. You can see that direction that's going, right? Now, there's roots. So this is like, people say, well, nuclear energy doesn't put carbon in the energy. But if you go back to the 60s, there was a scaling up of nuclear, but it's flatlined for a bunch of reasons. We can go into why. Some people think there might be a little resuscitation. But what's important about these technologies of solar and wind and that kind of stuff is they start scaling. Look at that hockey stick. Now, who would you want to bet on, in this case, is going to help us get to that clean energy? Well, they're putting it into, that's non-hydro, by the way. That's just these new kind of renewables now. Now, I'm going to flip quick to auto, just to give you the other thing here, and we're going to keep moving fast. But that thing, too, if you would have gone back 10 years and said, oh, when are electric vehicles going to happen? People say, it'll never happen. But then Elon Musk, Tesla, blew apart the whole paradigm for the auto industry, and now every single auto company on the planet is going full guns on this thing, right? Why? Same drop in price. There is a price in 91 of what a lithium-ion battery, you can see in the cost per kilowatt hour, it's now dropped dramatically. It went down 100%, basically. It's come down, similar to the way I just showed you in the solar cells, but over a little bit longer time frame. Anyhow, the prices came down. They're expected to go down another 2 to 3, 5 times. This is an estimate by a really respected guy I know. So this is not, we don't know for sure, but until 2030, but they're going to go down further. And so what happened? You started to watch globally. Electric vehicles are scaling. They're now 10% of all new car sales in the world are electric right now. Even here in the US, which is a laggard, we have hit 5% of new car sales. And that's an interesting point because that often is the tipping point. That's often the tipping point for these new technologies. About 5% of market penetration. Enough people see it and go, oh, damn, I want one of those. Boom. They usually take off. Not everything takes off at that point, but this one could. Now, what's projected, because we're talking about the future here, by the way, China and Europe are already at 20%. We're at 5, they're at 20%. This is facts. The unshaded area, they're at 20. But the projection is we'll probably lag if you just kind of think about it. But we could catch up. But that has a little bit to do with how we're going to do that. But that's one way to look at the next 20 years. And another way to look at it is essentially we're going to throttle back production of internal combustion. And we're going to have this hybrid middle thing. But this is a pretty credible way to think about the next 20 years here. And here's one that I just want to show you, which is exciting. Norway, which, by the way, was an oil state, right? They have now hit it. They're now up to 80% of new cars are full electric, not even hybrid. And look at how that went, basically how fast that went. Once you kind of click about where the future's going and how fast you want to go, now it's a small country and stuff. But basically, these things could go faster. And these projections that could actually be accelerated. Now, I want to kind of go economic long boom. So basically what I mentioned to you, long booms are essentially technology booms create economic booms because they create new industries, new jobs, new investors, new money, new entrepreneurs, all kinds of crazy stuff happening. So we're about to go from a tech boom in AI, a tech boom I just showed you. If you can't make money in transitioning to clean energy, you better you should get out of business. And basically, we got here with the biotech, which I'm barely going to touch on here. But anyhow, we got a triple whammy boom, folks. The next 25 years is just going to be a crazy kind of thing going on around technology, which kind of brings us up to ubiquitous AI, which I talked about briefly. Now, you're a data company, so I want to go fast on this. But it's worth knowing the data basics. Some of you here are probably up to this. Most people understand what a terabyte is. But if you keep going, adding zeros, you get to petabytes, exabytes, and zettabytes. So look at that exabyte and zettabyte thing. Just keep that in your head when we think about this next thing, because you're part of this transition here. If you go back to the beginning of people banging out information on clay pots 10,000 years ago, 8,000 BC, all the way to the turn of this century, 2000, 2003 here, all humans kind of put together about 5 exabytes of data. That's what we did. That was the second line up, by the way, not the bottom one. We are now doing that about every 2 days, and the world's information is now doubling every 2 years. So we're in that hockey stick thing again. It's happening. So if you go, so I have to, just because of the scale here, you got to bring it down here. So now we're at about 60 zettabytes. That's the lower threshold there, right? Because why? Everything's getting captured. Every phone, everything. You guys, you're all digital now, right? But every business has gone through the last 10 years, the digital transformation. So now it's like, oh my God, we got so much data, we don't know what to do with it. And they expect by about 2025, we're going to hit about 175 zettabytes. That's that lower thing. So we've got an insane amount of data. Now, here's the thing about AI. AI is essentially a function of data. No human brain can pierce the patterns in that kind of data. It's just impossible. I don't care how many librarians you got, whatever the hell it is. I mean, it's not going to happen, right? But AI can. And in fact, with this new large language models, which is what's behind the generative AI, the more data you put into it, the better it gets. I mean, it's just, and so this ChatGPT thing, GPT-4 too, that's based on essentially 25 terabytes, just terabytes of data, but it's essentially the entire internet is basically trained that thing, which now can speak to human beings in really sophisticated ways. If you haven't tried it, you absolutely have to try this. So I'm going to get quick here on a bunch of things. Now, what happened? There was essentially, starting about 2018, these large language models started to be understood as probably the future. There had been a huge debate. They had been basically sidelined for 40 years. There's a great story behind that. But basically, about 2018, they said, this is going to happen. So you saw investment in corporation. Investment exploded. I don't know to what extent you guys did, but probably. It sounds like I heard a little bit about how would you do it. Startup funding, though, which just came last year with OpenAI starting to go, boom, now startup funding is through the roof right now, and it's going that direction. By the way, just to kind of say, and I've got a little bit from San Francisco, but I'll mention this. Half of all generative AI investment is now going into San Francisco. Well, into California, technically. But it's essentially San Francisco. Again, we'll see where that goes. These will be the next Facebooks and Googles and everything, I think. But anyhow, the point is, here's comparison to some of the other places around here. But just in case you want to say, is San Francisco over? I would say no. I would be basically very tuned into what's happening in San Francisco here. ChatGPT went 100 million people tried it out within the first 2 months. There had been never anything remotely close to that kind of pickup in anything, any technology. It is now on daily, monthly, this is monthly users. Monthly users are now, there's more people doing ChatGPT than LinkedIn, Netflix, Reddit, all those things that took 25 years to get to where they are. It's a crazy important thing. Now, what I would say looking forward is you got to start thinking anything to do with human intelligence is now starting to be rethought. Could a machine start to do that? And here's a good place to start. Is these are price increases or decreases since the turn of the century, roughly 2000, or actually late 90s. But anyhow, what is the thing that went down? Everything that went down was like TVs. TVs are cheaper now than ever. Cars are about the same. You get essentially a car for the same price you had 25 years ago. Everything above that line is all related to labor. College tuition, they haven't changed since medieval times. Basically, childcare, medical care, all these heavy labor costs, basically. Even, believe it or not, housing is also still built like we did it in 1940. And so anyhow, all those things you start thinking, what could these smart machines start doing? Now, there's a bunch of ways to think about this, and it takes more time. We don't have the time to do it. But basically, the red places there are saying physical jobs are probably going to have are not going to be affected by this. So, for example, building, construction, that's the red ones. Very little impact. The blue ones are ones where these will essentially, generative AI will supplement knowledge workers. Probably affects your field like that. You should really look at that. The gray spaces are the things that people think will be serious displacement, like early, fast. Legal, and basically office administrative, because everyone's going to have a base, a virtual assistant within a couple years here. Anyhow, it's an interesting thing, but it's not going to be some crazy mass panic of layoffs, but it's going to affect kind of everything. And the one last thing I'll say here just about the panic around that kind of displacement is that when spreadsheets came up, because again, this is another lesson for the past, and that was right about here. That's Lotus 1, 2, 3, and by the way, that's Excel. When everyone was freaking out that bookkeepers, accountants, oh my God, we're going to have mass layoffs and stuff. And in fact, there did start to be layoffs. But what came up off that, the people using that material, essentially accountants, auditors, financial managers, now we've had more employment in there. There's been no mass layoffs. In fact, if anything, we've got more people working in this stuff because of these technologies. It's kind of a crude analysis, but I think that's a better way to think about what we're heading into here. We are going to head into a lot of accelerated innovation. I'll give you one example of this, which is interesting. Again, these are large language models speaking language. They're speaking English to us. They're going to speak, Hindi to somebody else, and they can do it. Here's what's interesting. So this is how many people in the world have English as a first language. Everyone in this room is probably that. Basically, it's not even 500 million people. There's 8 billion people on the planet. These are the people who have these other languages as a first language, including Chinese. How many people here know how to speak Chinese? I was a foreign correspondent in Asia. I tell you, I had to have a translator with me all the time. There's no way you can learn Chinese in a short amount of time. I mean, it's like it takes you 10 years to figure it out. Anyhow, I'm just joking, but now the technology is allowing you to basically, it's going to be simultaneous language translation with all the subtlety and nuance of human translation is happening. Like in the next, they think it's about 2 to 3 years. So just think what that does with all the different cross-fertilization of ideas and all kinds of information exchange and all kinds of stuff that happen, including you don't have to be a college grad or have essentially master a second language like every other person on the planet outside of English has to do. It'll open it up to everyone. It's interesting. I don't know where it's going to go. And the last thing I would say is people get freaked out about, oh my God, we don't know how to do this or don't know how to do that. Human ingenuity is just incredible. I mean, people have gotten so good at problem solving and innovation that in fact, I would just say, don't discount what humans are going to do with these tools to solve climate change and all these issues that we're wringing our hands about. How will we ever solve it? Well, we're not going to figure out how to solve something, right off the bat. You got to but trust that human ingenuity is such a good play out. That's one of the things I say to a lot of people. I want to say one last thing here about genetic understanding, because it's a bigger category and it's harder to explain, but since I teed it up, I want to just give you this. What most people, lay people, don't fully understand is that the biotech world has gone through a similar revolution now. And so it took, to crack the first human genome, it took 15 years and $2 to $3 billion to do that. And that happened about 2000. Actually, it was technically a little bit after, 2002. Since that time, the cost per human genome has dropped dramatically to the point now it's about $1,000. And in the next couple of years, I think it'll be about $100. Anyone in the room could get it for $100. Their entire genome, everything about it, fully understood and analyzed to the extent that human knowledge understands it. If we would have gone at the pace of the Moore's Law thing, which we thought was amazing, it would have taken twice that long. So this is actually beating. It would have taken 40 years. It took 20 years to do this. So we have got this crazy cheap thing. And the second thing is to, again, for lay people to kind of explain it a little bit, is we've now have figured out how to cheaply and easily edit these genomes. And that happened about 2013 or 14 in a thing called CRISPR. You've probably seen it. Again, but I'll mention it. It was essentially the woman from Berkeley, UC Berkeley, Jennifer Doudna, won the Nobel Prize on this. Basically, they figured out how to do this. It's cheap and easy. Happened about 2050, let's say, when it got recognized. And this is just investment in startups in the biotech space that started after that. Again, I use this as a proxy of like what's on the horizon to say we don't know exactly what's going to come out of these startups, but there's a lot of them happening, basically. And so we are going to get to a place where we can manipulate plants, animals. Now, there's some ethical things around that, which can be interesting to talk about. But basically, we are now starting to see where we could actually genetically engineer products, materials, and you could almost say, and also animals. Now, here's one example I want to just give you because you say, well, okay, is that on the way future? But there's now 80 startups in the Bay Area working on essentially cultured meat. So cultured meat is essentially you take a cell from a living animal, or fish for that matter, you put it in a vat, you give it the same amino acids and water and all the stuff that essentially a cow roaming around would have to eat over the course of their lifetime, and you put enough energy in there, but basically it creates meat. It's really meat. It's the same cell, so it tastes like meat. You didn't even have to kill the animal to do it. You do it. Now, this is a thing called cultured meat, that grown in a culture is one way they think about it. Now, one of the reasons that this is being driven, this slide is a little bit out of whack here, but I'll just say, it's because beef has a huge negative impact on climate. There's been a lot of interest of like, how could you grow beef without letting all the cows roaming around? And so that's what I say they started to do this thing. Now, what's interesting is there is a projection out for about 2040 that you could imagine, particularly this cultured meat, that's the top there, growing. Plant-based meat is like Impossible Burger that we already see, and then conventional meat throttling back, kind of like we talked about with the cars. Now, so the point being there is that this cultured meat would essentially be able to kind of transition in the same kind of way. Now, this is further off, and it's not going to have the same dramatic impact. And that cultured meat, by the way, won't be your great steak that we just had today. It'll be like McDonald's hamburgers. I mean, there's so much McDonald's hamburgers in the world now that if they can be done with cultured meat, great, let's do it. But we'll still have a good steak once in a while. Now, okay, I'm going to kind of wind up here with a little shift because I mentioned a bunch of things here that I want to do fast. And I think it's worth going through because you can't just think about the technology. You have to think a little bit about politics paradigm shifts. Now, what I want to explain here is give you some data on that beyond technology. One is a generational shift that everyone in this room has to really fully understand, particularly senior leaders at a company like this. One is essentially the generational shift in America here. These are the entire American population in 2020 by generation. That, essentially in between those two dark spaces, is the guts of the American economy. All the workers, all the people who buy stuff. That was 2020. And one thing you see there is half the boomers were retired, and a lot of them were dying off. Not to be mean, because I know there's boomers here, and I'm on the tail end of a boomer. But I mean, it's facts. And that was 2020. If you just go out to 2030, essentially that's America. And what those millennials and those Gen Zers, they have a very common sense. They basically all true believers in climate change and doing something about it, all into diversity, all that kind of stuff, and I'll get to that in a second. But essentially, and I know there's a lot of Gen Xers here, but I'm sorry, you just were a smaller generation, so you didn't have the same heft. But the boomers are essentially exiting, And so we're watching something that is clearly absorbed by the culture. Like, why is all of corporate America and Disney here? We're in Orlando. Why is Disney promoting, gay rights and DEI and standing by climate change? It's like, even if the politics outside them is screaming bloody murder about it, it's because everybody who's coming to Disneyland, all the people who work there, all the people that want to buy stuff from Disney, they're like, that's what they do. That's what they want. So the culture shifted. Politics has not shifted yet, but it will, because just keep playing this thing out. It's just the next 25 years that I just told you is, it doesn't, that's the world. Now, those are the kids. We don't know what they're going to be like. But anyhow, we know something. The other thing about it, which is key, and all you people are managed at some level, both those generations are about 50-50 split of white and people of color, millennials and Gen Z. So this is an extremely important thing for them. And it's going to only get more extreme because they're basically going to intermarry. They are intermarrying. And it's just going to be, everybody's going to be kind of people of color in America over the next century here, or through the 2100s here. And this is due to two big booms. There's that earlier boom in the early 20th century, this thing, boom, coming from Europe. It was throttled back after World War II. Then the second great boom came. Actually, right around the time of Reagan, started opening up again. Both parties were part of this. Boom, we had a second big boom. That's all just playing out in American politics now, or American demographics. This, as the percentage of people of color go up, percentage of whites go down, that's America in 2020. And we're on track to about 2045. Essentially, whites will be a minority in all of America. Now, this happened in California 15 years ago. Far from it being some strange, bizarre place, it's like, it's fun. It's great. I love California. Anyhow, the point is, fears of that are kind of overstated, in my opinion. But basically, this is the facts. This isn't illegal immigration, by the way. This has nothing to do with, this is just playing out the numbers. Now, I will say, and this gets a little tricky, but I want to lay this out to you, because you cannot understand as a business or as a person or as a parent what might be happening in the next 25 years. At least you contemplate politics. And I know that's a very touchy subject, so I'm going to try to touch it. And you don't even have to believe me on this one. You can just say, okay, here's an interesting guy's idea. But I think it's worth thinking about. American politics has basically been seen essentially a back and forth between two kinds of politics. Basically conservative and what they call progressive. Progressive has also been called liberals in different eras, but basically in general, in the big picture of history, it's these two eras. They're kind of in the word itself, you kind of get an understanding. Conserve, progress, renew, but it's positive, both sides. You got to renew to the old values. You got to actually reinvent sometimes and try something totally new. This has basically gone back and forth. And what America has done, it doesn't think, okay, how are you going to totally change America? All it takes is, this is American population. All you need is, at a 50-50 split, is just take 10% into one camp or the other. And I would argue the last 40 years, it was more of a conservative country. Because there's about a kind of coalition of 60% of Americans kind of went with that idea. I would argue we're moving into this, partly on those demographics I laid out to you, but essentially, so you got to start thinking, what will happen if you have a progressive era? Now, if you think back to that pendulum swing of America, the last progressive era we had was after World War II. It was basically Social Security, the Great New Deal, the Great Society, all that kind of stuff, the building. It was a great boom. There was all kinds of stuff around that was positive too. Then we had, I would argue, a conservative era. Ronald Reagan came up. We basically had a very different approach, but entrepreneurial, very positive things that happened out of that too. I would argue that we've seen the end of that with Trump's was the end of that. And, that's a live question here, so I don't want to get in a bar fight tonight. But basically, I would say it would be better to understand the next 40 years, which is what you guys are planning for and that you're trying to think about, that it's going to swing back the other way. The values of looking out for everybody, public investment, kind of all that kind of stuff is going to probably come back. And whether you like it or not. And I will just say one last thing here, and this will push maybe some buttons, but I just want to point this out because we don't think of politics like that. We think about these red state, blue state things. And I'll just show you kind of one thing that's worth thinking about is Republicans, that conservative Republicans have essentially lost 7 of the last popular votes of presidents. For the last 8 presidential elections, there's only been one time that a Republican has won the popular vote, and that was George Bush, second time in 2004, and that was the spread of electoral votes, by the way. You can see it in there, which is, healthy, 30. This was essentially what happened last time. And one of the things you're seeing here is you're seeing that West Coast politics is going into the Southwest, and East Coast politics is going down, including into Georgia here. And here's what I'm going to give you, what other stat here, look at the numbers. With the pandemic, and these numbers have continued since the pandemic, you watched an outflow of millennials from the coast and the big cities into the heartland looking for housing, basically, and also they could remote work. All those green counties are counties that grew in population. Look at Texas, look at Florida, look at the kind of West that's generally thought of as ruby red. There is essentially a shifting demographic that's going in these places. So I think, again, just think about the future, there's going to be increasingly the potential of battleground states that are moving closer into what used to be thought of as impregnable. And I'm saying that not to, again, stir anybody's pot, and you have your own personal politics, whatever. I'm just thinking, but from a strategic point of view, just neutrally, it's like, that would be a better way to think about it than it's going to go the other way and California's going to turn red. Just said. Now, I want to finish here with a few last pieces. I don't want to keep it too far from going to the bar here. But all these big changes I'm talking about are not just happening in America. They're happening all over the world. This is a huge and dramatic time in world history. And so what's fascinating about American history from the big picture global perspective is that about every 40 years, America goes through essentially a reinvention or a transformation. And this has happened from the very beginning. Actually, off the Revolutionary War, there was kind of a period that was kind of dominated by essentially the Founding Fathers kind of crew. There was a backlash. This is Andrew Jackson, more of a populist backlash that changed politics for the next 40 years. Then there was literally the Civil War, which kind of changed politics in a different direction with the new party of the Republican Party. And it wasn't just about slavery, it was about all kinds of stuff. Transcontinental Railroad, Homestead Acts, all kinds of stuff that was happening to grow America. Then he went through another change with the urbanization of America and kind of the progressive era. This is Teddy Roosevelt, but Woodrow Wilson was that. Is that both parties do this? It's not one party doing it. It happened again off the Great Depression, World War II. And basically it happened again with Ronald Reagan, shifted the politics. Now again, it's not about one person changing the whole thing. They're kind of emblematic of what happens around these eras. And I'm telling you, we're moving into another one. And I don't know who that is. It's not a current crop that's, necessarily running here or whatever, but something's going to emerge in this decade, I think, that'll essentially crystallize this era. Another fascinating thing as we kind of tying up here is that in the global fight, you could say, between democracies and autocracies, and this is a good chart that goes way back to basically the American Revolution. Every time America goes through one of these transformations, there's been a crazy uplift, like in the progressive era there, boom, a boom in more democracies. There was another one around World War II, boom, democracies made another push against kind of autocracies. With another one, with the beginning of the kind of end of the Cold War and the Reagan thing, boom, another hit again. I think we're actually, and this is where we get into the last kind of strategic realm here where we're entering, which I want to end you with. And that's basically now we've got another superpower, China. I've reported on China. I was there after Tiananmen Square. I've spent time in a Chinese jail, literally as a journalist. Anyhow, I've always wanted this to be kind of a together we figure out the future thing. But there's been an interesting shift. And I think what's interesting happening here is now these two superpowers are kind of, this is the growth in sync for the last decade. People thought China would surpass us, and that's probably not going to happen for a bunch of reasons we don't have the time to go into. But we're going to have essentially a really a rival there. And here's one that you probably hadn't thought about, but essentially there's only really two superpowers in AI, and it's China and the US. By the way, these images are beautiful because China's going a more centralized approach, and kind of the US and the West is going in a more crazy kind of other approach. But anyhow, there's going to fight this. I hope it's not fighting, but there is going to be essentially divided this. And that's between, and here's one metric I just want to point to you, the fastest supercomputers in the world. The US used to dominate the thing. China, basically the last 10 years, has been actually expanding dramatically. The whole rest of the world is that gray spot. There's really two powers now. And China, by the way, has got a lot of, now they don't have the same cutting edge AI as us, but they got a lot of entrepreneurs in that space. And so what I'm worried about, and I think you should also be worried about, is potentially a new Cold War. And you're starting to see it happen in geopolitics now. And think about all the supply chains and all kinds of stuff that's going to have to work around if this happens. And there is a scenario that we could imagine moving inside a Cold War, or with, hopefully not in one. But I'm thinking this is not, again, if you think about the next 25 years, you have to think about that. So I'm going to end here back to the beginning. Despite what I just said there, giving you a little kind of negative, oh, what about that? I would say in general, I think we're moving into a great era of progress, a really incredible era of progress. I think we are going to watch a transition away from this world rapidly into this world. And I think we're basically going to end up not just in that kind of laying the foundation for what ultimately this century is going to be, that world that I mentioned earlier beyond. And I think people literally in 50, 100, 1,000 years from now, I think they're going to look back at the early 21st century and they're going to say, that's when the world went digital. Everything went digital, and then that's when they mastered AI. That's when they finally got him around to AI, which we're still using today, 1,000 years later. They're going to say that's when the world went global. That's when they started working on a planetary scale. They weren't thinking about these kind of little kind of isolated nation state things. And they're going to actually look at it and say, that's when the world went sustainable. That's when they finally figured out how to basically kind of live on a small planet with 10 billion people. And ultimately, they'll look back and say, oh my God, wouldn't it have been amazing to be there in that critical time, the great progression, around the time where they really laid the foundation for this incredible transformation of the civilization to come. And with that, I wanted to say thank you, folks, for kind of staying with me on this crazy journey. And if you want to basically get more from me, here's where you can find me, and have a great conference, basically. Do we have time for a few questions? I went a little bit long in this, but it's a lot of material, and I thought, honestly, these guys, they've had a drink here too. They might stay around for another couple minutes. Anyone have questions? Now, there's a lot of provocative stuff in there, but there's also a lot of kind of stimulating things. Like, give me any sense of feedback. Don't be shy. Or questions or whatever. Here, we got one here.
What force could upset the emerging U.S.-China dynamic, in your opinion?
Wait, say one more time. What does that say?
So if the two new superpowers, U.S. and China, what would be the force that could disrupt that?
And also, Blinken was there today, right? So Blinken was there trying to forge a better understanding.
Yes. So I want to be very clear. I'm not a warmonger. I'm not pushing this. In fact, I've been late to the game here. I was very but here's what happened. In short order, what could happen? Xi could be essentially retire, or Xi, which is their supreme commander, Xi, basically, is essentially broken the covenant that the Communist Party had that they were going to turn over leadership every 10 years. And that is taking them back to a time of Mao Zedong, and basically a period where you can have one supreme ruler who just keeps ruling. Now, every time an autocratic or totalitarian government goes there, it's a disaster in the long term. Because no society this complex, or any, living in this kind of complexity, can just be controlled by the brain of one person. So, for example, he made a totally stupid idea. He locked down the entire China for the kind of COVID thing. It completely destroyed their economy. But no one could kind of put their hand up and say, hey, this might be a bad idea. What do you think? Whereas in the United States, we're having this crazy debate back and forth, and people, the states doing different things, and that's the craziness of American democracy or Western democracy. But it's also a pluralistic society that's working it out, trying to figure it out, and it's openly talking, and no one's going to be in jail for saying, hey, I think it's a bad idea. And anyhow, in the long run, in these things, the open societies, the pluralistic societies, the democracies innovate better. And so the best thing that could happen is somehow he dies, or he somehow gets ousted or something. Same thing happened with, by the way, Russia. I mean, Putin, what an idiot. I mean, the guy, no one could say, hey, invading Ukraine, our military isn't quite good enough to do that. And what happens if it doesn't work? Nobody could do that. You'd get shot, or you'd put in the gulag, or whatever the hell it is. So of course it's a total disaster. But no one can now say it's a disaster. Let's pull out. Anyhow, the point is, that route is, how to change it is we have to figure out some leadership thing, or pressure them so much that the internal pressure gets so intense on those leaders, including with Putin, that they'll change. Now, Putin, I'm not worried about so much, because they're just basically a giant petrostate. China is another thing. That is an incredible superpower. And that is a worthy superpower that we've never faced anything like that, honestly. The Soviet Union that we did after World War II is essentially empty. Anyhow, they're not China. They were not then, and they're not now. So it's an interesting thing, and it's a very sad thing. So anyhow, that would be my quick question. And we can move on to other stuff. Here's somebody here. I think they want to run the mic for you guys.
How real is the impact of the chip ban to China on their ability to advance in AI? And if it is real, is there another company or is there another country that can benefit from that outside of the United States?
Everyone heard that, right? Basically, so the CHIP Act is essentially a first move in a Cold War. And China's threatening Taiwan is another move in a Cold War. Meaning, to the extent, again, you get deep in the weeds on this, but basically, all the best chips in the world are either made in Taiwan or they're starting to be made here. I mean, you just saw that Nineveh's AI chip essentially is now, it put them into $1 trillion company in almost overnight. So anyhow, so the idea that you're starving China from the best technology is clearly a move to basically in this cutaway. So that's essentially a lot of the chess game that's happening here. But to be fair, we've offshored so much of our chip making capability that bill we just got through with bipartisan support, because everybody understands that, or not everybody, but people understand that in Washington, we now need to beef up dramatically our ability to scale chips. And what I just showed you about the AI world is like, boy, it's only going to increase. In fact, right now, there's already a backlog, huge backlog on chips around AI. I mean, everyone wants them and they can't get them. So anyhow, this is a bump in the, I would call it a bump in the road. Now the signals, here's the thing about, global economy. You send out a new signal, we're going from this carbon, we're going to clean. It's like, and then everyone just kind of goes, and okay, now how are we going to solve that problem? It starts to move. This is what I've told to I've been weirdly talking a lot to legacy auto companies because they want to understand, well, how did the last thing work in the digital thing? And I'm saying, here's the thing, because they're saying, well, how are we going to charge all these cars? Like, who's going to own all the chargers? And I'm thinking, dude, it's like we're just putting out this new signal. There's going to be 25 different efforts to do it. There'll be this mosh pit of kind of competition. Somebody will figure it out. And, it'll coalesce. That's what happened with, people didn't know how you're going to get high bandwidth internet to your cell phones in 1995. It's like no one had any clue who was going to win it, how it was going to do it. But they knew in general that was going to be a thing that people were going to need to do. And so you went into this crazy telecom thing, the dot-com thing that somebody mentioned there. But anyhow, it's an exciting time, but I'm thinking, so now it's just a matter of new signals. That's what that paradigm shift I'm saying. If you kind of buy into that, and you don't have to buy the whole thing. You can buy a chunk of what I was saying or whatever you want. But the point is, those are like sending new signals. It's kind of saying, okay, this is where we're going. Boom. How are we going to solve that? Who's going to win? How do we do it? How do we scale? Boom. And that's the exciting thing about, I would also say, I know you guys are a legacy company, but in general in these transitions, startups, and I know you just acquired a few startups. Startups often rough out the early way forward in these things, and legacy companies in general, maybe not you guys, but have a harder time adapting to big, fast changes. So I'm just saying that. I don't know your company, but I would say be open to changes fast and also be very tuned into startups potentially because they tend to have no legacies to worry about. They just try a million things. Anyhow, this is my little tough love question to you that you could debate tomorrow. Sorry. I don't know. I have no idea how you do your thing, your research, but just seen it a million times. So anyhow, any last question? I don't want to keep people from the bar and all the whatever you're going to do tonight. But
this is leadership conference, not sales conference. So. There's no bar.
Are we good?
Is there any last question? If not, let's give a warm paychecks welcome to Pete.